I was just a kid when my whole world collapsed. My mother, our rock, our only hope, was kicked out of the house, and we had nowhere to go. We were struggling farmers, barely making enough to survive. But that day, everything changed. I remember standing in the middle of the dusty road, watching my mother beg my father not to do this. But he didn't listen. He slammed the door in her face, and just like that, we were homeless. I didn't know where we would sleep that night or if we'd even eat the next day. My mother tried to stay strong, forcing a smile as she wiped my tears, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We walked for miles with nothing but a small bag of clothes, hoping for a miracle. And then, out of nowhere, something happened that still feels like a dream. A black SUV pulled up beside us, the tinted window rolling down slowly. I had no idea who the man inside was, but my mother gasped, covering her mouth in shock. It was him, Keanu Reeves. Yes, the Hollywood legend himself. What was he doing in a small farming town like ours? And more importantly, why did he stop for us? He looked at my mother for a long moment before saying something that sent shivers down my spine. Get in. I know what happened. How did he know? What did he want? And how could a struggling farmer and her abandoned child possibly be connected to one of the biggest movie stars in the world? What happened next was beyond anything I could have imagined, and it all started that night on that lonely road. I hesitated before stepping into the SUV, my mother gripping my hand tightly. Her breathing was unsteady, and I could feel her fingers trembling. She didn't know whether to trust him, but what choice did we have? We had nowhere to go. The moment we sat inside, the warmth of the leather seats was a stark contrast to the cold reality of our situation. Keanu Reeves turned to us, his expression unreadable. I've been looking for you, he said, his voice calm but firm. Looking for us? That made no sense. My mother had spent her entire life on our small farm, working from sunrise to sunset just to put food on our table. My father used to be a good man, or at least that's what I believed. He promised us a future, swore that hard work would pay off, but year after year we sank deeper into debt. When the farm barely produced enough to sell, he changed. The long silences turned into harsh words, and those words turned into something worse. Until finally today, he threw us out like we were nothing. I glanced at my mother, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had sacrificed everything for that farm. Her youth, her happiness, her dreams. And now she had lost it all. But what did any of this have to do with Keanu Reeves? As the SUV rolled forward, he reached into his coat pocket and handed my mother a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words before gasping. "This can't be real," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. I leaned closer, trying to read it, but before I could, Keanu spoke again. "You deserve to know the truth." The truth about what? About him? About us? My heart pounded. This was just the beginning, and I had no idea what was coming next. My mother's hands trembled as she held the paper, her breath hitching as she read it over and over again. I could barely make out the words, but I caught glimpses, something about land, signatures, and a name I didn't recognize. Her eyes darted to Keanu, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you showing me this?" Keanu sighed, his expression heavy, as if he had been carrying this burden for far too long. "Because you were never supposed to lose that farm," he said, looking straight at my mother. "Someone made sure you did." A chill ran down my spine. My father? It wouldn't have surprised me. He had grown bitter, resentful of everything, blaming my mother for his failures. But there was more to this than just a man who gave up. I could see it in Keanu's eyes. "I don't understand," my mother whispered. "What do you mean?" Keanu reached for the paper and turned it over, revealing another name stamped at the bottom. A name that made my mother's face drain of color. Mr. Langley, the banker. The same man who came to our farm every month, pretending to be patient while secretly tightening the noose around our necks. He had promised extensions, claimed he was helping us, but now it was clear. He had been planning to take everything. Keanu leaned forward. "He forged documents. He manipulated your husband. He made sure the farm would be taken from you." My mother's breath came in shaky gasps. But why would you care? Keanu held her gaze. Because I knew your father. Silence filled the car. My grandfather? The man who died before I was born? What did Keanu Reeves have to do with him? I had a feeling we were only scratching the surface of something much bigger. My mother's grip on the paper tightened, her knuckles turning white. My father, she echoed, her voice unsteady. What do you mean you knew him? Keanu exhaled, rubbing his temples as if debating how much to reveal. Your father was a good man, the kind who helped people even when he had nothing. But that made him enemies. Langley wasn't just some banker. He's been after your family's land for years. Your father refused to sell, and when he died, let's just say Langley made sure his debts didn't die with him. My mother shook her head. No, that can't be. He never told me any of this. Keanu's jaw clenched. Because he didn't want you to carry the weight of his fight. But Langley didn't stop. He waited, manipulated, and when the farm started struggling, he saw his chance. He convinced your husband that selling was the only way out. And when that didn't work, he forced your hand. A thick silence filled the SUV. My heart pounded as I tried to process what this meant. My father didn't just give up. He had been played. But that didn't change what he did to us. He still threw us out. Before my mother could respond, Keanu's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. Without a word, he turned the SUV down a side road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Where are we going? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Keanu's gaze stayed fixed on the road. Langley just filed new paperwork. He's trying to sell the farm today. My mother gasped. But that's illegal. Keanu's voice was cold. That's never stopped him before. We were running out of time. The SUV tore down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust as Keanu gripped the wheel with steely focus. My mother clutched the papers to her chest, her breath shallow. We have to stop him, she said almost to herself. If Langley sells the farm, we'll never get it back. Keanu's jaw tightened. That's exactly what he's counting on. Once it's gone forever. I felt my stomach twist into knots. This wasn't just about the land. It was about everything my mother had fought for, everything my grandfather had sacrificed to keep. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating. Then Keanu's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his expression turned to stone. It's worse than I thought? My mother turned to him, fear creeping into her voice. What do you mean? Keanu slowed the car and looked at us both. Langley isn't just selling it. He's already found a buyer, one who wants to tear the whole farm down. My mother gasped. No, he can't. Keanu's voice was tight. He can and he will. And if we don't get there in time, he'll have the papers signed before the sun sets. The panic in the car was suffocating. My mother looked like she was about to be sick. But what can we do? He has the law on his side. Keanu's eyes darkened. Not if we expose the fraud first. Then just as the farm came into view, my breath caught in my throat. Langley wasn't alone. A group of men stood near the barn, suits pressed, briefcases in hand. The deal was happening now, and we were already too late. Keanu slammed on the brakes, and the SUV skidded to a stop just outside the farm gates. My mother's breath hitched as she took in the scene. Langley stood in the middle of the yard, flanked by two men in suits, papers in hand. A third man, tall, smug, and unfamiliar, watched from a distance, arms crossed. Keanu's grip tightened on the steering wheel. That's the buyer, he muttered. If he signs those papers, the deal is done. My mother pushed open the door before I could stop her. Langley, she shouted, storming toward him. Langley turned, his expression shifting from irritation to a sickening smile. Ah, Mrs. Carter, you're just in time. In time for what? My mother snapped. You lied to us. You manipulated my husband and stole our land. Langley chuckled, flipping through the documents in his hand. No, he signed it away. You might not like it, but that's how business works. Keanu stepped beside my mother, his presence like a storm rolling in. That's where you're wrong. He pulled out his phone. Because I have proof that you forged those contracts. Langley's smirk faltered for a split second before he forced a laugh. You really think some Hollywood actor is going to stop me? The buyer frowned, glancing between them. Forged, he repeated, suddenly less sure of himself. Keanu held up the screen of his phone. A direct email from a former employee of yours, one who's willing to testify. Langley's face darkened. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. You don't know who you're messing with, Reeves. Keanu didn't blink. Neither do you. Then, before anyone could react, Langley did something none of us expected. Langley's smirk twisted into something darker. In one swift motion, he grabbed the papers and tore them in half. Gasps echoed through the yard. The buyer stepped back, his confidence shattered. You think this ends here? Langley growled, his voice low. You have no idea what you've started. Keanu didn't flinch. Neither do you. Before Langley could react, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed against the barn as two police cars sped down the road. My mother's eyes widened. What? Keanu exhaled, slipping his phone back into his coat. I made a call before we got here. Langley's crimes go deeper than just fraud. Two officers stepped out, one of them reading aloud from a notepad. Mr. Langley, we have evidence of forged documents, coercion, and unlawful land acquisition. You're under arrest. Langley's face turned red as he whirled toward the buyer. Don't listen to them. This is a setup. The buyer took another step back, his expression cold. I don't do business with criminals. He turned and walked off without another word. Langley snarled, but before he could protest, the officers locked handcuffs around his wrists. You think you've won? He spat at my mother. You're still broke. That farm is still worthless. Keanu crossed his arms. Not anymore. My mother frowned. What do you mean? Keanu pulled out another document, one he had been holding all along. He handed it to my mother with a small smile. I bought the farm back, in your name. Tears welled in my mother's eyes. But why? Keanu hesitated, then finally said, Because your father once saved my life. Silence fell. None of us had seen that coming. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she clutched the document to her chest. You bought the farm back? For me? Keanu nodded. Your father was a good man. When I was young and had nothing, he helped me when no one else would. He never asked for anything in return. I promised myself that one day, if I ever got the chance, I'd repay that kindness. He smiled softly. It just took me a little longer than I planned. My mother let out a choked laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. He never told me. Keanu's gaze softened. Because that's the kind of man he was. He didn't help people for recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do. The weight of his words settled over us. My mother had spent years believing she had lost everything, but in that moment, she realized she had never truly been alone. My father may have abandoned us, but the kindness my grandfather had shown had come full circle. As Langley was dragged into a police car, my mother turned toward the farmhouse, her eyes lingering on the land she had fought so hard for. I don't even know how to thank you, she whispered. Keanu chuckled. Just take care of it. That's all I want. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the fields. For the first time in years, the farm felt like home again. I looked up at Keanu. Are you staying? He smiled. I think my job here is done. As his SUV disappeared down the road, I realized something. This wasn't just about land. It was about redemption, about hope, about the power of kindness. And in the most unbelievable way, we had just been given a second chance.